going to just introduce the upcoming panel discussion, Amplifying Rhode Island's Unheard Histories. We are talking with 3 experts in history here in Rhode Island who come from very different backgrounds and very different platforms and think about history in different ways, which is always a good thing. So this panel is about local historians and scholars who will share their platforms and draw attention to voices often overlooked by the dominant historiography of our region. And I am actually going to take over and moderate this panel because that's what I like to do. So Tim, are you with us?
I am ready.
All right. If you want to start by introducing yourself, I will get your presentation up on the screen.
Nonprofit in North Kingstown called Swamptown Enterprises. It's focused on promoting and preserving the historic heritage of South County and trying to make a better story, is the way I like to put it, make a better story about the history of South County, an intriguing, complicated history. And I found over the years of working on it, I've been doing this for about 25 years now, that it's kind of like a puzzle. Each little fact that I would learn was one of the pieces of the puzzle, and eventually I got enough information in my mind to see the whole puzzle. When I did see it, I had a stark realization as I began to see that all of the information that I was building this picture out of, these puzzle pieces, all came from primary sources that were typically written in the era of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution by folks who had realized that the world that they were used to was changing rapid fire, and they felt the urge to write everything down, to collect artifacts, to get together and form small house museums and organizations to try to preserve this way of life that they saw. And if you begin to look at this, you realize that all of these people, by and large, that were doing this, the people who had the financial wherewithal, the education, and the time to collect this information together, write it down, start these museums, were by and large all rich white guys. And they collected the information, they wrote down what they wanted to write down, but what they did is they looked at it only from their perspective. So all of this information that most small towns their histories are dependent upon these types of things, all you have for primary material is the rich white guy's perspective on local history. When I saw that, I felt that this was unacceptable and began to refocus all of my work on getting the other side of the story, the contributions of other people to the story of South County, the contributions of Black people, the contributions of people with Native American heritage, and the contributions of women. This took some deep diving, some digging of information, but I was able over the years to fill in the gaps. And what I ended up with was a more interesting story, a 3-dimensional story, a more colorful story, and a story that allows me to be able to tell a better story about the history of South County. I've been over the years trying to find partners to work through with this, and Historic Wickford, or HISWIC as is known here, has been one of them, partners that I've worked with. And one of the first projects we did was an actual walking tour in Wickford where people can walk around and do a self-guided tour. We've had signage put up in the village of Wickford. We now have 13 of them. I've showcased a couple of them on this one. And this one just talks about the contribution of Black mariners in the village of Wickford. And one of these facts that people wouldn't realize, that there were so many Black mariners sailing the seas out of Wickford Village and out of other South County harbors and out of other Massachusetts and Connecticut harbors. Most of these people learned their skill set either as slaves themselves or from their fathers who were slaves, because agricultural slaves in South County, typically their owners wanted to maximize their profits off of these folks. So in the off season, when you don't need them for planting or harvesting, you want to find some skill set that you can then rent these slaves out to get some income. And the skill set most often needed in South County, especially in places like Wickford, was mariners. So a whole group of Black men were trained to be mariners, and their pays, of course, went back to their owners. But the reality was that they gained on this because they gained a valuable skill set when they finally did get freed, or they passed the skill set on to their children who were free. They were able then to have great lives. So this particular board talks about that and is up next to a house in Wickford on Fowler Street, that little house you can see in that inset picture, is a beautiful home built in the 1780s that was built specifically for a black family. A black family in the 1780s that had the financial wherewithal to have a fine home built right in the center of this incredible community of Wickford, based upon his ability to earn a living as a mariner. So that's one of the stories that we've told, and I've worked with Historic Wickford to get out there. A better story about the maritime history of the village of Wickford. The next one there we will look at is another one of the markers, a mock-up of it that talks about women's contributions to colonial era and federal period Wickford. And of course, we all have a pretty good idea of the lives of women in these time frames in most of New England. It was all about home and hearth, and the colonial Puritan kind of ethic that drove settlement in New England had a very specific box that it expected women to live within. And if you step out of that box, you are going to get slapped back into that box. But in places like Wickford and other places, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, some of the Connecticut shoreline communities come to mind immediately. Practical matters allowed this box to open up for women. Every able-bodied man in the community in Wickford was either going to sea or working at building ships, and the village had to continue. So even going back in the 1700s, women who had the interest were allowed to then step in out of their box and become something else, to be business owners, to be leaders of the community, to own property, to have a say in how the village was run. And I like to think about what that must have been like for these very brave women. There still was certainly a lot of risk for them to be doing that. But the reality is that these women stepped up and took roles in the community that everywhere else in New England would have been only open to men. So this board here is talking about that, and how women were able to do this and live in Wickford. And Wickford continues to have this tradition based upon this that began in the 1700s. I've got documented big business owners in the late 1700s, businesses owned solely by women because of this opportunity. Women working as the apothecary in the village of Wickford in the 1700s and early 1800s, essentially being the doctor for the community. Women who were leaders of religious leaders in the community, unheard of anywhere else in New England, but in these handful of small communities. And that's what this board tells. I like to think about somebody coming from, say, Boston or Salem to buy a sailing vessel here in Wickford and walking in and seeing the scene here in Wickford and imagining what these men would have thought when they walked into this place and saw all these women living very different lives than what they were used to seeing in their very Puritan communities. It must have been an eye-opening experience for these men. Another thing that I've worked on is developing PowerPoint presentations that I utilize to tell other stories that people don't realize, and our next slide kind of is about one of those. It's about what I call South County's sad little secret, and another thing that people have no clue about for the large part of the community is that the Negro cloth industry was a very important part of the economic future of South County. Now, the Negro cloth industry is a niche industry that is set up essentially because of the availability of power. And in the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, your power source was a river. In South County, nobody had big enough rivers to compete with the enormous broadcloth mills that were springing up all along the big rivers from, say, Warwick North and into Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and et cetera. So they had to find a niche industry where they could compete, where they could do financially well. And the Hazards and the Rodmans and their associated mill owners down here did find that niche industry. They stole the industry of making fabrics to be utilized to make slave clothing from small southern mills and dominated this industry throughout the next, say, 75 years, even beyond the Civil War period. And the reality is that the financial success of villages like Lafayette and Peacedale depended solely upon the selling of Negro cloth to first slave owners in the Deep South, and then eventually, after the Civil War, to landowners who were tending to sharecroppers. This industry still remained after the Civil War was over in a smaller scale, still making Negro cloth. So this is an interesting presentation that I will do in a setting where we're just sitting down in a hall or else during a walk. And I've had the opportunity to utilize one kind of a very neat thing to get people's attention. Now, the marketing trade name for the main fabric made by the Negro cloth industry in South County was Kentucky jean. It's a fabric that was closer to burlap than it is to any fabric we would have today, and it was made out of the worst of the raw materials that were around. Raw materials that were rejected for broadcloth mills were purchased and made into Negro cloth, into this Kentucky jean material. So, of course, this was a marketing tactic, calling it Kentucky jean, and kind of played upon an area where it was also made in Kentucky, and also on a French word for the type of fabric that was there. I've seen advertisements where they had a Kentucky jean person wearing a pair of coveralls made out of this material, strictly marketed as slave cloth. But what's cool about it is that a young man named Levi Strauss, who was opening up a mine supply store in San Francisco during the first gold rush era, was looking for a kind of fabric that would work for mine workers, something durable that wore like iron. And he caught wind of this fabric, this Kentucky jean fabric made primarily in South County, Rhode Island, and bought it and took it out to San Francisco and made miners' pants out of it. And the rest, as they say, is history. And I like to talk about this. This is the one time I can get high school students on a walking tour to put their smartphones down, is when I point out to them that those pants they have on there are directly connected to the pants that were made specifically in South County for slaves to wear in the cotton fields, and they ought to think about that a little bit. So it's quite an eye-opening thought that really gains their attention. And finally, the last thing that I've talked about a lot lately and shows up in the next slide is the very complicated story of the Narragansett Planters. And these are the planters, and although there's not a direct connection between the name, the Rhode Island and Providence plantations, I certainly will give it that, but there were plantations in Rhode Island, real live plantations that operated just like the plantations of the Deep South, and they were all in South County. Imagine, if you will, that all of what we now know as South County was owned by about 13 families, and all 13 of those families ran large plantations here, from 700 to 2,000 acres, manufacturing agricultural products. These were huge agribusinesses that were supplying not only Newport and Boston with agricultural supplies, but more importantly, the sugar industry in the Caribbean. The profit of the sugar industry in the Caribbean was such that they didn't want to put an acre of land into producing food or livestock to feed the industry, to feed the slaves that were working the sugar plantations, or feed the owners' families. They wanted that done elsewhere, and the elsewhere was here in South County. So it's an interesting, eye-opening story that we tell about that, which is also included on one of the markers that we have in Wickford. And finally, I'm working now on collections of stories. I have a book that's out already, and I have 7 or 8 books that I've self-published through Amazon. And the most recent one is called We Were Here Too, which is the collected stories of Black history in North Kingstown, which just focuses solely on the stories of Black folks in the community here, and mixed race folks, Native American Black people, and what their contributions were to North Kingstown. I'm now wrapping up a second book called We Were Here Too, Volume 2, which talks solely about the same situation with women in South County. So again, trying to tell a more complete history and do it in a way that is inclusive and respectful of all the players in the history of South County. So that's enough flapping for me. I'll turn it back to you, Amy.
Amy, you see why he's one of my favorite humans?
Yes.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, we are going to talk to Tim
Nope.
again in a few minutes, but we are going to let our other two panelists present first, Tim, and then I have some questions for you that I'm going to wrap into that panel discussion, okay?
Excellent.
Excellent. All right. Morgan, if you'd like to go.
Hi, everyone. I'm Morgan Grefe. I'm the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Historical Society. And I am going to attempt to share my screen with all of you. I am unfortunately having some computer problems today, of course. So I will try my best. And if not, I will make do with talking, but I will certainly attempt here to share my screen.
Would it be easier for you to email it over to us and we could do it for you?
I will see if I can make it work.
We see it. Perfect.
You see it, but I am having a very hard time. I'm only sharing parts of it to another screen, so I can't get out of things correctly. Can you see my main screen at this point?
No, we just see the slide.
We see the main your main logo and Smithsonian logo.
I, however, can't make anything work.
Yes.
That work? Okay.
You got it.
So the Rhode Island Historical Society, one of those organizations, I suppose, but not so small, that Tim was mentioning in his previous talk. We were established in 1822 as a northern and southern cabinet. And then in 1852, the Newport Historical Society formed and broke off as the southern cabinet and became its own organization. And so today, after talking with Amy and Avi, I'm going to talk a little bit more about sort of the structure of the organization, not as much on terms of content, but certainly can move into any questions that you might have about that. By the numbers, as an organization, we have about 25,000 objects, 5,000 manuscripts, 100,000 books, 400,000 photographs, and perhaps most surprising to people, about 9 million feet of motion picture moving image film. That is the largest moving image film collection in Rhode Island. And the greatest strength of our collection is actually news footage. So we have the B-roll and news footage of two of the main stations of the state of Rhode Island. And so this is a backbone of our collection. We also have 4 sites that people are most familiar with. Today I'm at our headquarters, the Aldrich House. We have the John Brown House Museum, the Robinson Research Center, and the Museum of Work and Culture. So briefly, here at the Aldrich House, we have some temporary exhibits, but we have mostly our administration, and it serves as a rental property as well. The John Brown House Museum, the current interpretation of the John Brown House focuses on the New Republic period, so when the house was built in 1788 on, and through the lens of the John Brown family, we talk about the social, cultural, and economic world of that time. And that's really where we begin to engage with the story of Rhode Island and the slave trade and enslavement in Rhode Island. At the Robinson Research Center, that is where you would go if you were coming to do research on our collection. Those manuscripts, books, all of that material lives at our Robinson Research Center. The artifacts are over at the John Brown House and are part of the museum collection. So our archival collection is at the Robinson Research Center, which right now is by appointment only because of the COVID crisis. So normally we are open 3 days a week to the general public at the research center, but right now, again, it's appointment only. We hope to someday emerge from that. And so here's where you can really dig in and find that material, as well as using old-fashioned forms of technology like microfilm, which is still considered the gold standard of all archival work. So many people say, well, why aren't you digitizing? Digitizing, we are digitizing, and we digitize for access. We do not digitize for archival purposes. For archival purposes, microfilm and microfiche are much more stable. So, and then at the Museum of Work and Culture, which is up in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, here's where we delve into the story of immigration, mostly from the Civil War on. The lens of the museum is begins with a French-Canadian story. Woonsocket, Rhode Island was the largest French-speaking city south of Montreal in North America, and was a very significant cultural site for French speakers. And so we tell the story of immigration and then expand that story into the immigration that runs forth, as Rhode Island, as you may know, had the highest percentage of immigrants in the United States from the 1890s to about 2000. So our immigration was really one of the greatest strengths of our population, of our demographics. And in this site, we also tell the story of organized labor in Rhode Island. Just wanted to give some quick highlights of the type of collections and the range of collections that we have in the museum. And we start with what's called the Fenner basket. This is made by Narragansett in the 17th century and was given to the Fenner family, and that we have it from the Fenners. You can see the very fine and detailed work. The basket is just a few inches high. It's a really exquisite piece. This is a pocket next to that, which is a children's pocket. So something they would have worn on a belt, on a dress, and would have used as an external pocket, or kind of predecessor of the pocket book. We then have this gorgeous powder horn, which was carved in 1777 and is one of the earliest known representations of Providence. And it is a carved map of Providence on this bone powder horn. And then we have the NASA jacket of Woody Springs, Rhode Island's only astronaut. So we really range from our earliest artifact is a 17th century cloak. And we go right up until now, which is one of our most recent endeavors, which I'll get to, and there's a slide a little bit later on the COVID archive. And so we actually have a partnership with the Providence Public Library where we are collecting born digital material related to the COVID era. But I wanted to highlight a couple of other special pieces in the collection. This is one of the flags carried by Rhode Island's 14th Heavy Artillery, the African-American troops from Rhode Island for the Civil War. So this is one of their flags and an exceptional piece of history that was saved. And we also have a lot of history, as Tim mentioned. A lot of history that we have is gathered by and written by particular perspectives. But just because something was collected for a particular purpose doesn't mean it doesn't contain information that is not of vital importance to understanding other aspects and other populations. So this is a piece of the Providence Town Papers. As you can see, this is signed by Roger Williams. But we have pieces of the Providence Town Papers that run through the 19th century. And just a couple of years ago, we were able to purchase a batch of papers that somehow were not included in the original town papers that range from 1801 to 1816. And while that just sounds like it may be a bland list of where funds were allocated, in fact, if you read the documents, it also is an incredible catalog of first and last names of people of color, both free and unfree, who are listed as transients. So it gives us a sense of people of color in Providence in that period, as well as women who are single and therefore listed as transient and on a sort of Providence town watch list of this time for whether or not they would become wards of the city. And so we can actually learn the names of people who so frequently are left out of the stories that we're telling. So I urge our researchers of all kinds to come in and don't dismiss traditional records because you think there aren't those stories in there. Read those sources and look at those sources with your own lens and with a different lens, and you'll be surprised at the stories that you can find within them. As I said, we're doing our COVID archive right now. And one of the other nice parts of that is we're getting to work with teachers and families and bring in a lot of voices of young people and teenagers in particular in this archive. That's also a voice that is quite frequently left out of the archives of larger experiences are younger voices. The one area in which we find those are our extensive diary collections. And so we have men's and women's diaries, and you can find them on our website, cataloged by the ethnicity of the writer, but also by the age or by the ease of reading their handwriting. So we try to make it as easy as possible for people to find what they're looking for. We know in archives, one of the challenges that we face moving forward is when they stop teaching cursive in our schools, it really has an impact on how people do historical research. We have college students coming in who can't read cursive handwriting. And so it adds already reading, let's say, 18th century handwriting is a challenge, but imagine if you don't read cursive at all. And so archives are having discussions about whether or not we need to start running actually public classes about how to read handwriting and how to write. So just another layer of complicating how to do historical research. We do a lot of work with school programs. We can look back here on the halcyon days of working with groups of children in person. We don't get to do that right now, obviously. And so we've had to expand our thinking, as all organizations have, and use the technologies that we have to reach our students virtually. And so we had to step up and start doing virtual field trips, virtual site visits, as well as creating Google Classrooms, which is the format most Rhode Island school districts are using. And we're really pleased that with the Google Classrooms, we were able to launch in April. By June, we had more than 4,000 individual students participating in those Google Classrooms. So our teachers are looking for well-vetted, trusted historic material to be able to give to their students. Because we don't have a statewide curriculum, teachers are left to their own devices to figure out what to teach and when to teach it. And they're looking for great materials and ways that they can fit it in and ways that they can use it virtually. So this has been a real learning experience for all of us and pushed us forward quite quickly. We also have a digital textbook called Encompass, which has modules that are growing. We hope by December we'll be launching 7 more. We worked with teacher focus groups throughout the state of Rhode Island to identify middle school and high school topics that teachers were most interested in getting more resources in. So this is free online, and you can access primary sources, lesson plans, videos, and other materials on Rhode Island topics. But we're also very committed to making history more accessible across the board. This means that our Museum of Work and Culture frequently acts as a bit of a laboratory space because it is handicap accessible and because it is such a kind of anchor within our community. We have initiatives that have been built out around, in particular, autism and our autism support community. We launched in February a memory cafe. And we do work with memory maps for people with memory impairment and their caregivers and support givers. We work with an interesting technology called IRA for people who are visually impaired, which we launched last November. And that's, unfortunately, COVID has made it hard for everybody to experience that in person. So we're hoping to keep that on and expand it as we reopen. And then we also have worked with actually our 8th graders in Woonsocket and a 3D printing lab to make 3D maps of the Blackstone Valley so that our normally kind of visually arresting maps that we have that people like to spend time looking at can actually be touched and felt and be more meaningful to those with low vision. And so for us, it's not just about telling broader stories, but how do we make our historic spaces more accessible as well? And we do that also with our national partners. As we mentioned earlier, we are a Smithsonian affiliate. We are a National Park Service partner in the Blackstone Valley, and we run National History Day in Rhode Island for our middle and high school students. In addition to that, we do temporary exhibits and rotating exhibits here at our Aldrich House headquarters and at the Museum of Work and Culture. And a lot of the time, we just spend time relishing our history in Rhode Island and loving all the quirky history that we've got, and the incredible photos and materials that people have been kind enough to share with us for the last 200 years. So that's just a quick overview of who we are as an organization. And again, when we get to questions, I'm happy to delve into anything more that you're interested in.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I love how accessible you are making history for those of us who are ready to delve into it. And I also love that you're actively now working with those schools who are struggling. We're all struggling, but especially students who just can't deal so much with the online environment. And but anyway, I do have a few more questions for you. I will ask them in a few minutes after we have our last presenter, Charles Roberts. Charles, I'm going to have you introduce yourself very quickly, and then I will share my screen so we can do the video, okay?
Oh, hi, everybody. Boy, after hearing these presentations from Morgan and Tim, I I don't know what to say, but I'll start. I'm Charles Roberts, CEO and Executive Director for Rhode Island Slave History Medallions, and we are a place-based education program. And our project is to put medallions. If you have a picture of it, they were the medallions created by Pompey Stevens, and yeah, oh, there we go. Oh, good, thank you. What they are, okay, yes. The medallions were created from the artwork of Pompey Stevens, who in 1768 signed his first medallion, or his first carved gravestone. He was with the William Stevens shop at that time. He was a slave, and for me, it's kind of an act of defiance, because a lot of people try to talk about slaves like servants, because it says on the gravestones, my faithful servant. And for me, all I can imagine is, because I've done enough slave work just for working very cheaply, it's when you're doing something with no reward, unless you're doing it because it's from your heart and you're really trying to serve the greater good of the community, it's slave labor. You're not getting paid for it. You're not being given any kind of respect for it. So you rebel. And when Pompey Stevens signed his brother's gravestone, I mean, he had to be saying to William Stevens, look, I'll carve all the rest of your these gravestones for you for the rest of my life for free if you let me sign my brother's gravestone. And being a businessman, I mean, this is just logic. William Stevens said, sure, and he signed it. But if he hadn't signed that gravestone, we wouldn't have known that these many angel images that we see across the state of Rhode Island and in Connecticut and Massachusetts were designed and carved by a slave or a group of slaves. So this is why we chose to use this angel image you see, which was after the Pompey Stevens image, because it's something that's universal. It gives a chance to, it's almost a universal symbol of Rhode Island. Its original is in God's the Laker at the Common Burial Ground in Newport. I used to play there as a kid, and run around and then jump off the pier at Van Zandt Pier. And then one year, as I got older, I was walking through there and I stopped and I looked at all the gravestones and I said, I was in a field of angels. And from then on, that spark, that piece of synchronicity hit me, and like I decided to do this medallion project because I wanted young people across the state of Rhode Island to see their connection to history by having an image like this, which is image versus text. And this is so that when people see this image, they instantly think of the slave-related history of Rhode Island and the stories of these slaves. And Pompey Stevens is one of those first stories I'm telling you right now. So we started our first project we started in 2017, and it was just some people of like kind who got together with me, and when I did the drawings for this project, and we sat down and we started working on this. We were inspired by the Middle Passage project that was in Providence, but then because it was about just ports, it wasn't telling enough of the story of the story of our slaves. So we decided to do this particular project. And now we started with Patriots Park. The reason we started with Patriots Park is because Patriots Park is the place where, for me, stories begin. As a child, I would go there and I watched it being built. My uncle Paul Gaines was who rest his soul. He was the first Black mayor and the first Black mayor in New England. And he inspired me, because as a child, I got a chance to see myself and my identity where I couldn't see that identity in any of the statues or any of the places in Newport or in the state that matter, because there was nothing around that looked like me or represented me or I could relate to tell my story. So Patriots Park became an important celebration for us once a year. And there on the walls, it has the names of all the slaves and the indigenous people and the European people who fought at the Battle of Rhode Island. Now, for me, the Battle of Rhode Island became the first battle for our state of independence. And what significance of it was for me was because it's an integrated army. It's Blacks and Indians and indentured servants, white settlers who got together to fight an army that was had taken over Newport. I mean, at no odds. They weren't, sophisticated like the Hessians, yet they held them back so that our armies could escape and to basically fight again. I mean, it was like Dunkirk, if you could imagine the type of what they were up against. And it wasn't a battle that they won, and Tim will tell you about that, but it was a battle where it was significantly fought to create what is now the United States. So, and plus it was Rhode Island. So that's why it meant so much to me. I've been born in Newport. So we placed our first medallion there. And when we placed our first medallion there, the issue was being inclusive and representing everyone. So when we did our presentation, they were Indian. I worked with Lorenz Spears, and in fact, and they blessed the land. And if you could, it was just a whole other experience of creating and capturing history, because it was so inclusive. Everybody's story was told there. We were actually celebrating the Battle of Rhode Island as it was then, not as it is maybe talked about in the history books. So we had a fabulous a group of people there. I'm with the Black Regiment. The Black Regiment did gun salutes. I mean, these guys are reenactors. When I joined them, I couldn't believe they know so much about history, but not from the book, from the thing like how to fold tents, how to carry your muskets and keep it from getting wet. I mean, I just can't express to you how much it is to be a part of living history by living it now. So that became also part of our slave history medallion story, because we're telling the stories of slaves. I was late today because today in Jamestown, they did a newspaper, came out about the installation we're going to do in Jamestown. But this is about the stories of the slaves in Jamestown. I mean, for example, the first slave, the oldest slave to die, and I have to get all this because I'm not an historian. I'm a facilitator. I'm trying to bring this information to the public in a way that is exciting. But the first slave, the oldest slave in Rhode Island, is from Newport. Died in Jamestown at 100 years old. When you hear these stories, when people come up to you and say, "Charles, will you tell our story? I'm from Block Island, and my great-great-grandmother and my grandfather, she was an Indian, and my father, great-great-grandfather was Black, and they were massacred by in Jamestown." And I said, "What?" That's how I'm learning history. People are telling me their stories. And then I have to go out and research it. And luckily I have people like Joanne Pope Mellish and I have people like Morgan that I can go to and Ruth Taylor at the Historical Society to verify these stories. Because you can't just tell a story like hearsay. It has to be verified. Even the stories that we made, the information we made available at Bowen's Wharf for that installation. I mean, to know that Benedict Arnold, the original governor of Rhode Island, had land from all the way down to Bowen's Wharf, where slaves were brought in, and to be able to, as you're doing the research and putting up these medallions, find out the story and the truths about. And this is Benedict Arnold, this is the grandfather, not the Benedict Arnold traitor, and his family and the women because the men died and they gave their land to the women, and then someone married the family. That's how it became Bowen's Wharf, to be able to see how so-and-so married so-and-so. And they'd bequeath their slaves so-and-so and so-and-so to their family, who then, it becomes a living history. And that's what I'm about.
We are now getting to the point where to be respectful of everyone's time, we want to get to some Q&A with the three of you and give the opportunity for the audience to ask some questions too. So I'm going to kick it off, and I'm going to ask all three of you kind of the purpose of this panel was to talk about the underrepresented voices. And Charles, you did a really great job talking about how you go about it. But Tim, I'd love to just kind of hear from you as you went through Swamptown Industries, and then Morgan too, as you started to work for the Rhode Island Historical Society. Are there guidelines that you're following, or in your scholarship, is there a reason or a kind of a motivation for it that's kind of written down?
You know, we are all, as scholars are independent. So we are a repository. We have, as an organization, our work is to tell a broader and more inclusive story for the state of Rhode Island. So basically, it's the story of all Rhode Islanders for all Rhode Islanders. And so when we are doing museum interpretations and we are actively collaborating, the questions that we ask ourselves using, we work with David LaPiana's method in the nonprofit strategy revolution. So the use of a strategy screen that asks us whether or not it is helping us to better serve underserved communities, whether or not we are able to actively partner and engage, so we broaden our collaboration and our collaborative footprint, as well as then how it helps us move forward in terms of bringing that history to a broader community. So I would say we have a sort of set of core values as an organization that guides our questioning for every project that we take on. And then independently, we all have, so my training, I specialize in the history of incarceration in the United States. So for me personally, I have my work that I do that doesn't have to fall into guidelines. And then as the Historical Society, as part of a strategic planning process, we have a shared sort of sense of community goals from our board and staff of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I think, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and you know, I have to agree with Morgan. I mean, there's really no guidelines. I mean, I'm motivated by what I started out talking about in the beginning, about finally realizing this incredible fact that what I all thought was the whole story was not even close to the whole story, and just my own personal desire to get the whole story for myself. Usually I operate pretty selfishly. I want to find this stuff out for myself, and I put it out to the greater world and hope they enjoy it as well. Because it's a better story. That's all there is to it. I mean, the story that we know is one-dimensional, but when you get the idea of putting everybody else who belongs in the story, people of color, women, you have a better story. And so for me, it's exciting to be able to fill that in. And Morgan's organization, and particularly as she mentioned, the microfilm collection, because for me, you know, this stuff is not recorded down by these rich white guys, but it's out there. It's out there in newspapers, old newspapers, the only place you can get them, a collection of newspapers. The collection of newspapers that they have, Rhode Island newspapers at Rhode Island Historical Society, is extraordinary. And it's a great resource. And diaries as well. I'm blessed down here in South County to be, over the years, to know people who have been gracious enough to hand over their ancestors' diaries. And these diaries are you almost feel like you're intruding on the past, because sometimes they're such intimate portraits of what people are going through, and you learn things that amaze you. And then of course, you just can't go by one diary, but over and over again, you find the same themes that run through in the same parts of the stories, and you can finally begin to get a real feel for what is out there and what life was like in the 1700s, the 1800s, and even the 1900s. And you know, that's been very helpful to me to make this story. And for myself, I made a conscious decision to take what I learned through research. I mean, I learned research techniques. You know, college educated, but I don't. What I produce does not come with the footnotes and annotated bibliographies, because what I really want to do is produce a product that will attract the attention of everybody. So I have fashioned myself to be the historian as a storyteller, and take everything I can and translate it, keep it right, keep it correct, keep it factual, but make it into a story. The average person, beyond folks like Morgan and myself and Charles, you know, are not so concerned about architectural styles and dates. They want stories, and that's how people learn, and that's how you get people's attention. So everything that I have done since the very beginning has been doing the research for myself, getting the research right, and then making sure that I can tell it in a way that will get people's attention. Because in this day and age, it's harder and harder to get people's attention. It really is. And I'm sure people are out there. I'm sure Morgan knows this full well, especially young people. You know, it is hard just to get their attention. Once you get their attention, then you can share with them stuff that will amaze them and make them think. But that first initial grab of someone's attention really matters. So you really do have to think of your topic and develop a hook so you can get their attention and begin to let them understand what they don't know.
Thank you. Charles, do you want to weigh in? Sorry.
Well, yeah, that's why the medallions have QR codes. Because with a QR code, you can get someone's attention, especially young people who live on their phones, in that 30 seconds. It's really difficult because I have to take volumes of information and break it down into 3 paragraphs and then break it down into sentences so that they can just hear things like, Stephen Hopkins, I'm standing in front of Stephen Hopkins Street, and gee, he signed the Declaration of Independence. Oh, wow, he was also a pirate. Oh, wow, he was also governor. And in those oh, wows, I gotcha. Just long enough that maybe you'll scroll down to hear the rest of the information. So that's the value of the place-based education, so that you can get that information right where you stand. And or if you're on your computer, you scroll down and you say, hey, this is exciting information, and you can see more. But I must say, I take the stories of Tim Cranston and Bob Geek and others, and because it's an education program, I use footnotes. So if Tim tells me a story, then I have to go to Morgan and say, Morgan, can you give me the footnotes and tell me what's the history behind it? Because I cannot put out false information. It's a study program, and you have to verify it, otherwise you get crucified. So that's the kind of difference, which is kind of making it harder and more complicated. But especially when you're talking to people that want to know the truth, the unvarnished truth of what happened. How did slaves feel? How did they get to be a slave? Did they want to be slaves? Well, these questions are out there, and now that history is come to basically right in front of us, these young people really want to know these questions. So you really got to be able to answer them so that they can then go and find the information for themselves once they've been stimulated by the question. If you ask a question and you get a young person gets a question, then they're already on their way to finding an answer. And that's what we do with stimulating people through a place-based education program.
And I think this is such an exciting time to be doing history as well, because of the fact that we have so many more ways for people to access it, but it also is so many more repositories are accessible to us. When I was doing my dissertation, I had to go to Idaho to get information that now I could get online. Not to say I still wouldn't go to Idaho, but I wouldn't have to be there as long. But we have an ability when people, I hear all the time say, I don't understand, history is history. But in fact, we're finding and accessing new sources every day. So stories we thought we knew, we're finding out new information that is complicating and changing and enriching each of those stories. So there isn't such a thing as, oh, we're done with that and we know what happened. We're learning more every day. Plus the fact that every single person who looks at a story brings their own perspective and lens and the information they have already learned in their own life to that story. And so there are an infinite number of ways to engage in our history and to share that story. It is, as I say all the time, it is a constantly renewable resource. And so this is such a great time. And as Charles said, a time where our students and our young people are asking for this in their schools. They're asking to learn this, and they want to be able to grapple with tough questions and big questions. It's a really exciting time to be in history.
All right, I have one more question. It's my favorite question from the pre-launch call. I know we only have 5 minutes, but maybe we can get to it. There is no state-sponsored history curriculum or state-required history curriculum in Rhode Island. What do you want to see if that changes? What do you want to see all students in Rhode Island learning?
You know, it's interesting because, you know, I have for years worked, or tried to work with the schools here in North Kingstown and had some great experiences with young students, working with elementary schools, middle school for a while, but I had a long battle trying to find a high school teacher interested in developing a Rhode Island curriculum. I did find one about 3 or 4 years ago in the town of North Kingstown. I'm happy to say has a really good elective half-year course on Rhode Island history developed by this teacher, and I've helped them out with that. But what it's made it, I think, successful, and it's, you know, he can't have enough spots, you know, every year it's full, is that he's developed it and realized what I've begun to realize is that, you know, you can't be a fish swimming upstream. You have to develop this curriculum based upon the way that young people want to get information today, and that's what we've done. And even with younger kids now, we're finding out that, you know, they don't want to learn things in a traditional fashion, and it's not as meaningful, and it doesn't hit home quite as hard in that sense. We've also tried to get kids from elementary school to the high school out into the community. You know, in a place like South County and anywhere, you don't have to take a class all the way to the Plymouth Plantation to tell a story, or to Sturbridge Village, because you can tell it right here in our own communities, and it means more to the kids if they know it's about their town. And I've had some extraordinarily meaningful experiences with kids. The one that strikes in my mind immediately is a 5th grade class that I took out to a historic cemetery, and we had a program. I worked with a teacher very closely, and these kids, there was a whole section of slave graves there, and these kids, I had the kids stand in front of one of these slave graves and tell a short story, 5 minutes, about a possible story of a life of this person buried in this ground. We don't know their name. They made up a name. They made up a story based upon research we had done, and it was one of the most moving experiences I'd ever seen with kids. I mean, we had the moms who were doing the chaperoning were weeping in the background as their kids were standing there telling these extraordinary stories that they had imagined for a life of a slave based on what we had learned in the classroom. And I've come across kids from that class, you know, now that was 15 years ago, or now young adults, and they still remember that one experience, and it really, you know, and it was, frankly, it was 90% white kids standing there on a slave's grave and relating to that person buried in the ground there. And just that one moment, I like to think, changed the way that group of young children viewed their world. And those kind of experiences, those little things can make a huge difference in taking a child and making him think differently about the world around him.
I've had the same experience with a group of kids from Rocky Hill School who went out to Smith Castle. And after being there, all of a sudden, they went back. They researched the slaves that were on the grounds of Rocky Hill School, found out their names, found out how they worked with Christopher Green, found out the ones that were his personal bodyguards at the Battle of Rhode Island, and made their own website, did their own research, and tracked their own information, and then reported it back to me. They knew more than I did. And someone said to me, well, Charles, you know, this is a difficult history. I said, I don't think so, because I'm learning mine from a 4th grader. So as I say, you stimulate, you ask the question. That's all you have to do. And you ask the question, people reach out. I get calls from everywhere, people reaching out to me. You know, I'm not a teacher. I really respect Morgan with the way that she explains her research. I'm not that person. I have to find people to be that person. And everyone's out there, because we're all actually, when you think about it, we are already an inclusive community, because we have we all have the same story to tell in different genres and different respects. So I think that this curriculum and I was fortunate to be given a resolution in the State House, can grow when people like myself and Morgan and Tim get together and make this thing that people are asking for take place right now.
You want me
Is
to
the 5
go?
minutes up yet?
So certainly I second everything in terms of, you know, my own work has been mostly trying to create spaces for African-American history to be shared in our classrooms. I think if I were to choose one other thing, it would be to put Rhode Island's history in a global perspective. I think that from the origins, from the first immigrants who came here as colonists to the indigenous populations, as I said earlier, our strength is in the incredible diversity, but as a maritime province, we have this long history of exchange through ideas, through cultures, through economies. And I think that, you know, years ago, I heard somebody on the news was at a conference and on globalization, and he said, you know, people act like globalization is a new thing. And then he paused and he said, I mean, it's been happening since the 1970s. I would argue it's been happening since before the 1970s, and say that, you know, from its very origin and before, from the age of exploration, we have been in a situation of exchange. And I think positioning Rhode Island's local stories in a bigger story of where they fit globally is really important to help make those connections and bridges for people to understand how big and how small this world really is.
That is a perfect way to end that conversation. I want to thank all three of you so very much. I know that you're very busy people and you have lots going on, both in history and in life. I really, truly appreciate you joining us today.